As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So Dmitry Medvedev, he's the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council. He said Sunday that if Ukraine's struggling counteroffensive was successful, Russia would have to use nuclear weapons. So he wrote on Twitter, quote, "By repelling the collective enemy's counteroffensive, our armed forces are defending Russian citizens and our land. It is quite clear to all decent people. Besides that, they are preventing global conflict," end quote. Medvedev said that if Ukraine's counteroffensive was successful and they took away part of Russia's land, that Russia would have to use nuclear weapons. And he referred to Russia's nuclear doctrine, which allows the use of nukes if Russia feels its existence is threatened. He said, quote, "There would simply be no other way out. That's why our enemies must worship our warriors. They are keeping global nuclear fire from flaring up," end quote. So throughout the war, Medvedev has been very hawkish in his rhetoric, pretty over the top, but I still think it's important to highlight that you have a Russian official here saying, if Ukraine is going to win, by the West's by its own definition and by what the West's definition is, I guess, as well, that means, we're going to use nukes. And I think it's just important to highlight that because it goes to show how much more important this war is to Russia than the U.S. and NATO. Saudi Arabia to host Ukraine talks, what they're calling Ukraine peace talks, except Russia's not going to be there. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Saudi officials have invited diplomats from 30 countries, to attend talks on the Ukraine war in early August. While it is unclear which countries will send a representative to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia did not extend an invitation to Russia. So Riyadh hopes that officials from up to 30 countries, including the US, Ukraine, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Egypt, Mexico, Chile, and Zambia, will attend the talks slated for August 5th and 6th. So those are, a few of the major non-aligned countries. And really, the whole idea of this summit that they're trying to, call peace talks, if you see the reports in this, in the Wall Street Journal, Saudi Arabia hosting Ukraine peace talks. I got excited when I saw it. I thought, oh, wow, are Russia and Ukraine going to talk? No, they're not. And the point of this, what the U.S. and its allies want to do is try to convince these countries to, side more with Ukraine and adopt Ukraine's demands for an end to the war, which is a full Russian withdrawal, which is really, a non-starter for peace talks. So, this is certainly not conducive to peace. That's just the reality. It doesn't really matter how you feel about what Russia's doing in Ukraine. The reality is the demands for a complete Russian withdrawal, which includes Crimea, is just a non-starter for peace talks. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Saturday rejected Australia's concerns about WikiLeaks founder and Australian citizen Julian Assange, who faces up to 175 years in prison if extradited to the U.S. and convicted for exposing U.S. war crimes. So Blinken was in Australia with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to discuss bolstering military ties between the U.S. and Australia. At a press conference during the visit, Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong said Canberra has made clear to Washington that it wants the U.S. to drop its case against Assange. She said, quote, "We have made clear our view that Mr. Assange's case has dragged on for too long and our desire that it be brought to a conclusion. And we've said that publicly, and you would anticipate that that reflects also the position we articulate in private," end quote. So Blinken was there and he confirmed that the issue has been discussed but rejected Australia's concerns. He said Australia must recognize the U.S.'s position on Assange, claiming the WikiLeaks founder's alleged actions risked very serious harm to national security. Blinken said, quote, "Mr. Assange was charged with a very serious criminal conduct in the United States in connection with his alleged role in one of the largest compromises of classified information in the history of our country. So I say that only because just as we understand sensitivities here, it's important that our friends understand sensitivities in the United States," end quote. So Assange has been indicted under the Espionage Act by the U.S. Justice Department related to documents WikiLeaks published that it obtained from former Army Private Chelsea Manning. But Assange obtained that material using standard journalistic practices. And if he's convicted in the U.S., it would set a very grave precedent for press freedom. Niger coup leader joins line of U.S.-trained mutineers. So this is from Nick Turse at The Intercept, and he is confirming that one of the Niger coup leaders was trained by the U.S., and that is Brigadier General Moussa Salahu Barmou. He's the chief of Niger's Special Operations Forces and one of the leaders of the unfolding coup in Niger. He was trained by the U.S. military, and The Intercept has confirmed that. U.S.-trained military officers have taken part in 11 coups in West Africa since 2008. And in 2021, Barmou said that Niger had a very long relationship with the U.S., and it's good to work with them. And just last month, he met with Lieutenant General Jonathan Braga, who's the head of U.S. Army Special Operations Command at Air Base 201, which is this big drone base in the Nigerian city of Agadez, and that serves as the linchpin of an archipelago of U.S. outposts in West Africa. He did not return phone calls or text messages from the intercept. So a U.S. official tracking the coup confirmed Barmu's relationship with the U.S. military and said that he was probably not alone, basically saying we're going to learn that more of these coup leaders were trained by the U.S. Again, the U.S. is very involved in Niger, has about 1,100 troops and this big drone base. And so far right now, the situation with the coup, the EU suspended aid. The U.S. is threatening to suspend aid to Niger. So we'll see how it plays out. So again, just because, these military officers were trained by the U.S., that doesn't mean that this is like a U.S.-backed or orchestrated coup. It just goes to show how, because a lot of times after these coups, the governments, kind of turn away from the U.S. and become more friendly to Russia. And it's just kind of shows what a failure of policy this whole counterterrorism strategy in Africa is. And Tursk puts the numbers in again, just staggering numbers. In 2002 and 2003, there were 9 terrorist attacks in Africa. And that's when the U.S. started giving this counterterrorism support to Niger. So 9 attacks in those 2 years. Last year, there was 2,737 in just Burkina Faso, Mali, and Western Niger alone. So complete abysmal failure. And that's U.S. That's the terror wars. That's what it is. Complete failure.
The Peter Schiff Show.
But I think that big rally in the market created a sense of comfort for the Fed that, we could slip in another rate hike. And in fact, going into the decision, the odds of a rate hike were near 100%. So, of course, by then, I was pretty much of the view that we were going to get a hike. I no longer believed that the Fed was done, because one thing I've learned over the years is the Fed never wants to surprise the market. So if the market is certain the Fed's going to hike, well, the Fed hikes. The Fed doesn't want to surprise the market, disappoint the market, give the market a reason to be concerned. After all, if the Fed didn't hike, the markets might have thought, why not? Why didn't they hike? What's the problem? What are they worried about that we don't know about? So when the markets are kind of blessing the rate hike because everybody believes the Fed's going to hike, and then, the markets are going up anyway, there's no reason for the Fed not to hike because it can kind of get it in. But the question is, what's going to happen next? Because Powell is still indicating that there's one more hike. But that's really it. And whether or not we go from 5.25, 5.5 to 5.5, 5.75, I don't think that really makes much of a difference. But it's pretty clear from what Powell said, not only in the prepared remarks, but in the press conference that followed, that this is pretty much it. Because Powell mentioned in that Q&A that they don't expect any rate cuts this year. Well, the year is half over, right? We're, next week we're starting August. And so the fact that we're not going to get any cuts this year shouldn't surprise anyone. But what Powell did indicate is that the members of the FOMC believe that the rate cuts are going to start next year in 2024. So I think that's pretty dovish to let that cat out of the bag, that we're going to start cutting rates in 2024. And, it doesn't even make any sense for the Fed to even suggest that rate cuts could come as early as next year, when the Fed also removed from their forecast a mild recession. The last time the Fed met, they had a recession in their forecast, which is something they never do. Now, they kind of clarified it by forecasting a mild recession, but they still forecast a recession. They've now changed their mind. According to Powell, based on the economic data that has come out since that forecast, the economy now looks strong enough that the Fed's base case is now a soft landing where the economy avoids recession. We don't even have a recession, and we don't even have any kind of big pickup in unemployment. Well, if that is really the case, if the Fed thinks there's no recession anywhere in sight, and according to Powell, we're still a long way from reaching the 2% inflation goal. He said many times that inflation is still too high. It's a threat. It is, eroding purchasing power. It is hurting the middle class. It's hurting the poor. We're a long way from victory. Given that, if we're a long way from achieving the inflation goal, and the economy is now so strong that they're not even worried about a recession, why would they talk about rate cuts as early as next year? Also, I think the most significant announcement that came out of the meeting is that Powell admitted that the Fed is not going to wait for 2% inflation before it starts cutting rates, because Powell said we don't believe we're going to get back to 2% inflation until sometime in 2025. But he said the Fed is forecasting the first rate cuts to happen in 2024. Well, why cut rates if you're still not at your 2% goal? Well, what Powell tried to say is that we don't have to wait for 2%. We will just assume that if we've made enough progress and we're moving in that direction, well, we'll just start cutting rates anyway. And we'll just assume that the prior rate hikes have got us on a glide path so that we can still get down to 2%, even if we start cutting rates, which makes no sense. In fact, Powell admitted that the Fed is still restrictive in its policy, but that by next year, it may not only move to neutral, but move to accommodative. He said we may lower interest rates to below neutral next year. How are they going to do that? We're not even close to the inflation goal. Yes, if you look at the headline CPI, we got down to 3%, but it's not going to stay there. Oil prices dropped almost 50% between, I think, the summer of 2021 and about 3 months ago. It was about a 50% drop in oil prices. That was really what brought headline CPI down from 9% to 3%. Well, over the last 3 months or so, oil prices are up 25%. We closed the 5th consecutive positive week for oil. We closed above $80 a barrel. Gasoline prices now in the country are at the highest they've been all year. We're seeing other commodities that have already turned. The dollar index is weakening. It's bounced, it's back up to about 101, but the dollar is in a decisive downtrend. Everything that you're looking at, all these forward indicators suggest that inflation is going to get worse, not better. These big banks, they got no problem with taking politicians. So they took the Bidens and all these accounts. They filed over the course of, I'm not sure how many years, 170 suspicious activity reports. Those are called SARs on the Bidens. That means the bank saw something suspicious in the transaction and notified the government. Hey, look, we're worried about this transaction in this account. The government did nothing. Now, you could see, okay, maybe 1 or 2 SARs, no big deal. 170 on the same group of accounts and nothing? I mean, what is the point of requiring banks to file these suspicious activity reports if you don't even look into them? They must have looked into them. Somebody at the Justice Department, somebody somewhere must have looked into these SARs and saw that they were linked to these Biden-related accounts, and so they did nothing. Here's the irony. None of these big banks, despite filing all of these SARs, none of these banks closed any of the Biden's accounts. They just let them keep on banking. Even though they were doing all this suspicious stuff, they kept the account open. They kept processing all these suspicious transactions. All they did is tell the government that they're doing it, and they figured, okay, we covered our butts, but they continued to bank these LLCs. Now, contrast that to what my bank would have done. We would have shut the account down. We wouldn't have just continued to bank them. We got a lot of SARs that we filed, but we always shut the account down. We didn't want to take a chance. And again, the government wasted, the U.S. government wasted 2 years, spent all kinds of money looking for evidence that my bank was helping people launder money and evade taxes and found nothing. At the same time, they were handed a pile of evidence on a silver platter that the Bidens were actually evading taxes and laundering money, and they did nothing. So here I am, innocent, was punished. I lost my entire bank, and absolutely nothing has happened to Joe Biden or Hunter Biden or anybody in the Biden clan, despite the fact that there's overwhelming evidence of guilt.
I always predict it'll end because we'll run out of money. But there's a race right now. Which is going to be the biggest? Money for our militarism, or the money we're paying for borrowing the money for our militarism?
Yeah, really.
And we're at the point now where the interest on the payments to run this foreign policy is growing faster, and it will be the big thing. So I think everybody has their favorite things to look at for the economy, and the economists have a lot of different things they do just to distract. They never look much at the Federal Reserve. But I think if you have one item to look at, if you could get an accurate measurement of real debt, they can hide debt and obligations, all these different things. But if you know what the real debt is, that will be the limiting factor, because ultimately, even though it should have really challenged the dollar already, it's constantly challenging the dollar, because that means prices are going up.
Yeah.
And so that's the case. So we'll be watching that at least. But I just thought today, Daniel, this is a big bill. It's related so much to what we try try to do and get information out. But I would say the vote, which was, 86-11, we didn't do a very good job. But I still am optimistic that if the people really knew what was going on and really knew what was going on in our foreign policy, they'd have a different attitude.
Mind when I think of this bill is sleepwalking, because they continue to go on pretending as if we're absolutely the top dog. Our empire is unchallenged. Spending a little bit more money will shore up our empire. And in the meantime, as we see now, increasingly, our weapons, our training, everything that we spend the money on that actually should defend us, we're seeing it fail before our eyes in Ukraine. And so you're wondering, where is this money going? What's happening to it? The other thing, and I'll put on that first one if you can, the other thing about this that struck me is it's so classic DC. Because you remember, we talked about it on this show, the big deal about the budget ceiling, the spending ceiling, all this and that. Well, the debt ceiling deal, okay, that was going to really save us. So even though this bill authorizes a record $886 billion in military spending, well, that's okay, because that was the agreement set in the debt ceiling talks, 886, so that within that. But as Dave DeCamp points out from antiwar.com, this is the little loophole, Dr. Paul. Hawks in Congress, and that would be both parties, are planning to increase that figure even more by passing, quote, emergency supplemental funding, which is not limited by the debt ceiling deal. And you would say, absolutely. I mean, if we're in an emergency, who can deny them funding? Who can count how many emergencies there are?
There's always going to be one, and that's why that whole debate, pseudo-debate, had very little meaning.
Yeah.
But in spite of all this negative talk on our program today, the vote in the House was a little bit better. It was 219 to 210 when it passed the House. So that means, and they are closer to the people than I think the Senate, generally speaking. So they're getting the message, and I think they're feeling it harder. The average person of their pocketbook. I think they are catching on that when we're shipping so much money outside and we're having so many more problems here. If you listen to the president, he talks pretty good. Things don't seem to be that bad,
Bidenomics.
So, but the people aren't buying into that, so that's going to continue, and we will, of course, point out a couple things that where we have pretty good evidence that you shouldn't be overly optimistic. You already have one. The debt limit doesn't even do any protecting, and they can always cancel.
Well, so an amendment introduced by Senator Rand Paul to require audits and investigations of Ukraine aid failed in a vote of 70 to 28, with only Republicans supporting the measure. So every single Democrat voted against any kind of audit on this. The Senate also rejected an amendment to establish a lead inspector general for Ukraine in a vote of 51 to 48. Now, this was interesting because there was a procedural move in the Senate because they knew they were going to lose this to require a 3/5 majority on this rather than a simple majority. So on that second one, I think it was good because Senator Paul came very, very close to getting that inspector general, which you have to ask, why don't you want to know where the money's going? Why don't you want to know?
Well, I don't think they want to know. Well, they might know, but they have to know that to hide it. They just don't want the people to know what's going on. But I think that's where it's inevitable. They will wake up and they'll have to figure out that it has to be related to what the government is doing, and that spending is a big deal. The big issue, though, why that logic doesn't work, is that everybody has been conditioned over many, many decades to see what they get from the government as being very legitimate, and it's theirs, and you have other places where you're supposed to cut.
Good tweet on Senator Paul's amendments, if we can put that next one up. And I was just searching around. It's Nick Sorter. I don't know him. Apparently he's been published, whatever. But whatever the case, he has a good tweet. He says the U.S. Senate once again blocked Senator Paul's effort to require audits and investigations of the tens of billions that the U.S. taxpayer has given to Ukraine. You could say probably 150 billion, actually. He continues, this comes just 1 month after the Pentagon's $6.2 billion, quote, accounting error on Ukrainian aid. Yet the majority of both Democrats and Republicans still refuse to provide oversight. As a reminder, just last year, the Senate passed a bill to hire 87,000 new IRS agents in order to deeply dig into the finances of everyday Americans. You can't audit the money being printed for Ukraine. Why do you think Congress won't allow Ukrainian aid to be audited? And I love this because he says, they'll audit every single one of us and hire 80,000 to do it. But they won't audit this $150 billion to Ukraine.
But, I think we lose twice. So, of course, they take the money, they buy this and say, we have to send more weapons. Military-industrial complex has to have a life too, So they do that and send the weapons. But then it's not over. Does it do what they claim it's going to do and bring about victory? No, things get worse over there. And
U.S. announces $345 million in unprecedented military aid for Taiwan. So some of this money being spent is spent to poke China, try to get China to react, try to get China to do something. tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of miles from the U.S. We've got to get Taiwan ready for war with China. This is where the money goes.
Yes, and this is a belief. They think that money can solve all the problems that they create. But the biggest thing is they started from a philosophy of it's great to have an American empire.
Yeah.
I mean, they wouldn't call it that, but it's America's need, to spread our wonderful message of democracy and freedom and liberty. And it nauseates me when I thought I would have to listen to some of those members of Congress talk, and it sounded so wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
But it was all just a con game. And the system that we operate with and all this stuff is really a con game. So often it's painted in a picture of patriotism. If you don't do it, you're not a very good patriot. And what we really need more is maybe a little bit more common sense.